Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Friday stream. I'm Meredith, and I'm joined with Jim, but we've got a special guest here, Bret Farley from St Olaf College. Jim and I were able to meet Bret just briefly at WP campus this year in Georgetown, and Bret had an awesome presentation about WordPress Multisite and using blocks within their specific WordPress Multisite setup at St Olaf, and we just thought it would be a great opportunity to chat more about it. So I'm so glad, Bret, you were able to join us today. So if you want to introduce yourself a little bit, and we can get started.
Sure, thank you. So I'm Bret Farley. I work as a web developer at St Olaf College. I've been there about 2 years. I'm a relatively new developer. I was actually formerly a 3D animator, as well as a traditional animator. In fact, I animated in a lot of different mediums, but for commercial and medical, for a while, that's what I studied in school. But now I'm a developer. It's something I've always wanted to do, and I'm having a great time doing web stuff at St Olaf.
Tell you one of the things, so Meredith had the pleasure, and she was able to see your talk in person, and so that was back at WP campus. And part of what we're trying to do is kind of get people at WP campus who we saw talk on the Reclaim stream to kind of reflect on those sessions and talk a little bit about whether it's WordPress, higher ed, development, all that stuff. So you're our first guest in this series, I think. Is that correct, Meredith? So
Definitely.
You have to set exactly. You have to set a high standard.
I'll set the bar low so people coming after me can have that advantage.
You can't. But one of the things I wanted to say is I just watched your presentation this morning, so it's kind of fresh in my head. And I just want to say I really enjoyed your sense of humor and your use of some of that imagery. It was fun, and I really like that dry sense of humor. But you mentioned in your talk two things that I thought were interesting. You started 2 years ago at St. Olaf, and that this was your first project for their WordPress multi-site. And I was like, you mentioned you're a new developer. Are you new to PHP? Are you new to WordPress? Like, how did you get into development, and how did you find yourself developing plugins for WordPress?
Yeah, so it was definitely one of my first big projects, but PHP I didn't really know until I started working at St. Olaf. I got into web via Carleton College, which is the other small liberal arts college in Northfield, Minnesota. But I wasn't a developer there. I was actually a content person. I was hired contract to help them move these enterprise places have like 600 sites, and so we had all these sites that needed to go over to WordPress. And so in that process, I learned WordPress from a functional standpoint, like really well. I figured out how to do a lot of stuff without actually getting into the code base because I had to. And it gave me a really good sense of what you can do with blocks and what you can do with plugins. And, if you've got the Gravity Forms suite, which we also have at St. Olaf, along with Gravity Wiz and all those add-ons you can use, you can cobble together some pretty complex systems. But knowing that stuff and then teaching myself PHP and JavaScript, like I was getting up at 5 o'clock or 4:30 in the morning most mornings so that I could teach myself coding, and then eventually I got to the point where I was like, okay, I can start applying. So after 3 years at Carleton, almost 3 years, I landed this job at St. Olaf, and the commute basically stayed the same, but it's a very different, very cool job there.
Sorry, I'm muted. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is you did the WordPress migration or move at Carleton, And then you said you went over and there's a WordPress multi-site, and this is from your presentation, that you support at St. Olaf. That's 256 sites. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight to like, how is St. Olaf using WordPress? Is this enterprise? Is this like their .edu, or is this for teaching and learning? Like, what's some of the context of what you support and how?
Sure. Yeah, it is a .edu. It is the network of sites that comprises stolaf.edu, and we do have a separate server for things like student portfolio sites and sites that professors want to run for their classes and things. But yeah, multi-site. It's relatively small compared to Carlton's, and that's okay, because it's even 256 sites is a lot. We have a lot of support from communications when it comes to content. They're really good about handling content questions and things. But when it comes to managing those plugins, creating solutions for sites, or departments that need something particular, they need this group of students pulled from the database to be able to track them somehow, um, in a form system or a workflow. Then we can cobble that together, and really, PHP has become sort of a second language for me, because taking on WordPress as your enterprise system means getting really familiar with how it uses PHP, which is its own thing, and how to do those various tasks that you need to do in it. So
Meredith, you can step on top of me at any point. If you have a question, jump in.
Yeah, no worries.
But one of the things I was wondering, Bret, so if I'm understanding, this is faculty who are updating department sites. This is communications, obviously doing some of the main sites, but like, you're supporting a wide range of users who are updating their .edus. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So every department has their own site. Faculty don't do a ton of editing, but staff, usually a department has a designated person who is savvy enough to get in there and manage the content. But yeah, essentially every site in that network has its own user and an admin, and then a group of other users with various roles that can contribute as well.
So this brings us to a particular point in the conversation, right, Meredith? This brings us to the point of the cursed Gutenberg.
Yeah.
we have a joke GIF that Meredith made. So we've been supporting WordPress, doing early WordPress multi-site, at University of Mary Washington, for a long while. And the transition from the classic editor to Gutenberg obviously has a long trail of tears for people who had to make that transition and what that looks like, right?
Yep.
And so one of the things I noticed when you were talking is you were like, 2 years ago, my first project was, we're kind of moving off of, the classic editor onto Gutenberg. And, your solution came out of trying to make that process, what I understand, a little bit easier for the end users. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. When I started at St. Olaf, we were in the midst of this project, moving from a panels theme that Modern Tribe had developed for us, and develop. Thank you. Yes.
Sorry, the timing is a little off.
It's a perfect backdrop for what I'm about to get into. Yeah, panels were basically their precursor, their solution for Gutenberg, a pre-Gutenberg solution for creating content and putting it in these structured panels that would determine the look and feel of the site. So it was more than just a theme. It was a theme that was being in part run by a plugin, because this separate plugin was running these panels. And so that got real interesting, because when we went to move the panels over and make them into Gutenberg blocks, we worked with a third-party vendor who helped us with another plugin called St Olaf Gutenberg blocks, and they created this plugin to both migrate and construct these Gutenberg blocks from the panel content. And so in that way, it was it it was a lot of work to get things working in blocks the same way they worked in panels, because the paradigms are very different. But the look and feel had to be about the same, albeit a little better, because Gutenberg has a nicer interface. So that was sort of what that process looked like. And then as a result, what we had was a theme that was, we were going from a theme with about 12 or 15 panels that users could utilize to display their content. And then we saw on the other end this block inserter with, I don't remember what WordPress ships with, something like 60 or so blocks. Some of them are variations of the embed block, and some of them are, it was overwhelming. And we could see the need to sort of curate that experience for our editors, who are going from 15 panels to how many blocks do we want them to see? How many, we of course want them to stick to our aesthetics. So we've got our main ACF blocks, but then out of the core blocks, we had to sort of figure out, okay, we want to curate this. We don't want to give them too much control, but we want them to have the advantages that WordPress, what that Gutenberg offers. And then that's where the plugin came in. So
one of the things you said in your talk that I'm interested in is, at the point where you're talking about the plugin, you're talking about, you had 3 options, right? You can use an off-the-shelf plugin that may or may not work, a premium plugin that costs a ton, maybe does everything, or given you have a kind of bespoke setup there at St. Olaf, you would develop one. And so, like, I liked you setting that up, but like, when your team makes that decision, like, what's at stake, right? Like, you have the team to do it. Is that kind of like when you brought on, was it like, can you do it, Bret? Like what was the kind of decision, and like, how did that in some ways incentivize you to learn even more and start developing?
Yeah. Well, I think that if I had known what a process it was going to be, I probably wouldn't have taken it on myself. But I really was the guy saying, okay, we can't just give them all these blocks. I would really like to do something, but I wanted it to be ours, because I knew that we already had a mess of plugins that were driving our theme and our panels and our blocks, and I didn't want to really trust that to a plugin that may be short-lived, or that they seem like great plugins now, but what are we going to introduce, or what complexities are we going to find within our setup that are going to throw a wrench in the works at some point? So I really wanted the ability to control all the various types of blocks that we had, and know how and when they were being added, and then maybe as a result more easily manage them. But it could have gone one of those 3 ways. I think that part of me was like, I kind of want to do this. And I wouldn't say we necessarily had the workforce for it. So in between projects, I was putting this plugin together, and as a result, it took longer. But we actually launched about a day and a half after I finished the plugin, and it got real down to the wire there. I wasn't sure, like, are we actually going to launch this new theme and still have all these blocks showing?
There's nothing like trial by fire almost there, but I really like the way that you approached it by taking it in-house instead of relying on other plugins, because I think we're seeing that shift a little bit these days, especially with some current events happening in the WordPress community that could be impacting how plugins are even updated these days. So I think it's really smart that you took it in-house for that piece.
Yeah, in hindsight, I think I'm glad that I did.
Yeah. Especially when it's, .edu, right? Like a rogue plugin with a rogue update, and then everything breaks. And obviously you're testing it in development and whatever, but like, you have some control over it and it works for your model. It's just, if you have the resources, like you said, which are human resources and that knowledge, it's awesome to build on them, right?
Right.
I guess the question though is, with that plugin, like, is that something you're like, here you go, back to WordPress.org? Is that something like St. Olaf is trying to try and sustain and maintain? Like, that's the other piece of a plugin, right? Is there's a lot of great ones that people give to each other one-off, but it raises the same question of, can we develop it and sustain it so it will work, in perpetuity, if you will?
Sure. Yeah. And I did consider, like, how far do I take this plugin? Is it something that I want to make available? And I think that the big thing there is our particular setup is so complex and its own thing that I'm not, it could be done, but it's also something like we don't really have the workforce to maintain a plugin for other people. We have enough to maintain it for us, so it'll stay internal.
Yeah. I heard a lot of people in your talk being like, oh, so it does this and it defaults to that. So like, you certainly had some fans, if you will.
Well, I figured that would be the case because I scoured the internet trying to figure out how best to do this. I talked to people from Automatic asking, the registry shows these blocks, but it doesn't show these blocks. Is there any way to get those in the same way? And the answer was sometimes just no, not yet. Or yeah, there's this other way, but it may or may not work for your purposes. And so yeah.
Meredith, I have more, so don't worry.
Yeah, go for it. I'm listening. I'll chime in when I can.
Okay. So Bret, one of the things when you were discussing, a couple of ways at making the plugin you made. So you did a really good job, I have to say, in that talk for anyone who does, because fact is in that talk, you lay out the code and how you did it. So there is a DIY aspect. Is like, if you need to do this for your college, here's my roadmap and how I did it. So that was also super cool that, sure, I can't sustain it in the typical way because we're not an organization who has the firepower for that. But here's what I did. If you want to try it and if it works for you, take it and adjust it for your community. So that was super cool. I really love that ethos. But the other thing I heard in your talk is, when you talk about the different ways to do it, is some of the tension between PHP and JavaScript in the WordPress ecosystem. Am I right in saying that? Like,
Absolutely.
Is that part of your kind of struggle as you were doing this?
Yeah. So this really was a journey of figuring out how WordPress handles the various types of blocks. And I promised that I would show this, so I'll show it real quick.
Please.
Let's see. Select.
And Bret, while you're doing that, I did post the link to the presentation for anybody watching who wants to watch the whole thing. It's definitely worth a try.
Yeah.
It's a YouTube video, 35 minutes, and it's really well done.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, and this is the one Jim really liked. What kind of block are you? Is that that scene that is embedded in all of our heads from Civil War? But it's really true. Like, what what we're doing here is figuring out what type of block, and then going from there in terms of, okay, how does WordPress manage this block? When does it initialize this block, and when does it make it available, if ever, to the registry? And part of that was certain types of blocks are they're just JavaScript being implemented on the front end, and you can't, creating a plugin, of course, that controls everything in the edit view from the network is something.
We just edited out what Bret said. It was crazy. You'll
Technical
never know.
difficulties.
You will never know.
Yeah, I gotta watch my mouth. Yeah, it's something that that had to be grappled with, and yeah. I have much more to say on that, but essentially it involved figuring out when to enqueue the JavaScript and grab those lists, and then how to display them and as options, even though you're not getting that until it's you're seeing the user is seeing the front end. Sometimes it was hard coding. We have lists of blocks that for example, our blocks that are never going to change,
Right.
and if they do, like they did yesterday, I actually created a variation of a variation block for the accordion that we offer at St Olaf. So we've got this custom accordion block, and I keep getting requests like, can you make it full width? Can you make it look like this plugin that we used to have? We have this plugin everywhere, and I don't know if either of you have seen Collapsomatic, but that was a plugin back in the day. They have discontinued it, but it is a short code that you drop in, and so can we sort of replicate that? Sure, I'll make variations of our accordion block, and the fun thing there is variation blocks of ACF blocks need to be added to the options and checked on so that we can actually see them in the inserter. Otherwise, we don't get to see them. And that's because we have this control, this block hider plugin working in the background to curate that. The same thing goes for new blocks that WordPress introduces, which I usually love, but they don't always, fit our purposes, our theme, that they're styling things that need to be done. Those appear automatically in the block hider as a checkbox, but they're unchecked until I go in and check them. So they just stay where they are until we decide, okay, we want to use this block. Let's add a little styling to it, and then we'll check it on, and it'll be available for everyone.
And that's the feature a lot of people loved, because as new features are pushed out, there's no surprises. No one's finding it before you, and you're kind of like, oh wait. So that was super nice. The other thing that I think a lot of people appreciated was the idea that you can do this and you can control, like, for your community within a WordPress multi-site potentially. Now, it's not something you all do, but like you have permissions across the WordPress multi-site that are consistent, but could you do site by site permissions based on what a faculty member wants to do? And that's where you all are kind of developing for faculty, right? Like they're making requests, and you all through WordPress are able to do kind of unique stuff for that. And I'm fascinated by that, because you're like a dev shop.
Yeah, don't tell anyone. We don't want that word to get out. Yeah, no, I mean, the fact is, WordPress offers people a lot of control just out of the box. Users, admins of their own sites can turn blocks on and off for themselves. but just for themselves, because that I feel like is a feature that really is meant for single site editing, where you have one admin going in who doesn't want to see all these blocks. Then you can go to the options in your site and turn off whichever ones you want. But it does give you that amount of control. It there are other things that we could do. It really is a network thing, though. Even if we wanted to, I'm not sure on a site-by-site basis quite how we would control, allow this block for just these sites. Certainly, if a plugin was network enabled and then just activated on a site, I think that would allow them to do that. And that is something that we can do with our multi-site.
So the user could go in for their site and activate it because it's network enabled. Yeah. I mean, it's also one of the challenges of working with WordPress multi-site, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like everything is, oh, it works for WordPress. And then, you have to modify, and you show that in your code, how you were modifying it for WordPress multi-site to work.
Right. Yeah. And so there's certain things that are really straightforward about working in multi-site. And there are less documented things that, and when it comes to, say, the settings API updating, is an extra function that you need to add in a certain way that will allow the thing that it usually does, the thing that it wants to do, the settings API, it stops it from doing that, and it says, okay, no, actually update it and then return us to this settings page. And options are kept in a different table, and things like that. So you have to know where it's putting things, and that was a bit of a challenge too for me, not really having done this for a network before.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Meredith.
I'm curious with the introduction and more integration of the full site editor side of WordPress too, like if that's had an impact on the way the plugin works and all of, like, however the that block piece goes on that side.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I don't know that it impacts it. I don't, that's not to say that if we were to implement a full site editing theme, that we would suddenly have things to think about. Honestly, I think that most people aren't quite there yet. That people are still kind of waiting and seeing. Some people have ventured into the full site editing scene with entire themes, but for the most part, what I'm hearing is we are on a classic theme with the Gutenberg blocks enabled, and that is what this plugin is really meant for. But yeah, I mean, full site editing opens a whole new can of worms, and it's something that we're definitely, we keep saying, okay, maybe next year we'll start looking at a full site theme, and then the next year rolls around and they haven't really done much except rename a lot of stuff and move things around, and so I get the sense that it's sort of, it's still solidifying and gelatinizing into an actual concept in terms of how people would actually use it. Until that settles, I like the classic theme with Gutenberg blocks.
Yeah, and it already took, you just did the Gutenberg block switch 2 years ago, and then full site editing comes. It's like, it's like you try and do one and get settled, and there's a whole new world of I'm not a developer. So for me, when I see the full site editing, I'm like, well, this is WordPress for developers, right? Like, this is not WordPress like Gutenberg is supposed to be for users who are just kind of, doing what they might do in a Wix or a Squarespace. And I think it's a very kind of, how would you say, schizophrenic development in WordPress between,
Mhm.
making it easy for the user, and then, oh wait, if you're a developer, look, we can show you how all that works.
Yeah, they do seem to be at a bit of a crossroads in terms of like, well, how do we offer all this functionality, um, but in a way that people can actually approach it and use it. Um, and I feel, yeah, I feel like it's going to be interesting to see how the user base changes, and whether they adapt to, well, I guess I'll just have to get in there and learn how to lock down certain features, and which, for a developer, that's not that's not a lot to
Yeah,
ask. For someone who just wants a Wix or something, that feels kind of crazy. So,
it does. It's like you have your users talking about loops
hmm,
and it's like, wait, like I thought WordPress was kind of saving us a little bit,
yeah.
at least for some of us who weren't developers. So yeah, it is an interesting, but it brings me to another point. I want to get your take on this. I was talking to someone at WP campus. His name was Ben, and I'm forgetting his last name. He's at Michigan State, great guy. And he was basically saying, with our WordPress multi-site, we're going to do everything open source. We're not going to pay for any premium plugins, nothing where like we're basically locked in. And
Hmm.
that seems pretty smart right now, given what's going down with, the lockdown of WordPress.org potentially for certain plugins. So like, has that been something you all have thought about? I mean, obviously it's ideal, and
Hmm.
whether it can be lived to, given the nature of how plugins in the plugin market work, is something else. But like, how do you all approach that? Like when you're going and choosing whether it be themes or
Hmm.
plugins or what have you?
Hmm. Yeah. Um, well, traditionally, we will pay for features, pro versions of plugins where we think it's absolutely necessary or just really worth the price. Um, More and more, we are seeing, excuse me, we're seeing those prices skyrocket. We're seeing more features that should be free, uh, only available for paid versions, and I don't think that that's going to stop. I think it's probably going to keep going that direction. Uh, so I like the philosophy of we're only gonna use free plugins. I I approach that with some skepticism because I think that if it's free now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stay that way. Um, and in some circumstances, you get what you pay for. But I think the bulk of what we run is free currently. We do shell out for those must-have plugins. Um, but yeah, I think the market is changing really quickly at the moment, and especially in the last couple weeks, it's been exacerbated. I think that the availability of plugins is probably going to go down, and people are going to start looking out for themselves a little more, which I think just means we're going to be paying more.
Yeah. And the splintering of the community can't help, a sense of like we all contribute.
Right.
And I think, you know, when you think about that and you think about that return to, I'm going to stick with the open and free, like you said, free for how long, it does provide universities and groups like that the potential to say, okay, we're doing some stuff that might be similar. Like,
Mhm.
can we share some of what we're doing? Are there grants? Like, there are always grants for a lot of things. Like, what about grants to prevent, the kind of classic and shitification we're seeing with software in
Mhm.
general? And WordPress as an open source um, a project is not in some ways insulated from that, we're seeing. And that's a kind of a question for higher ed, if you
Mhm.
kind of think of higher ed as this space, this green space where some of this stuff can happen
Mhm.
without the same demands. Because we've seen it crazy with software.
Mhm.
cPanel, for example, once they were bought by a venture capital firm, like
Mhm.
their prices went up by like 5 times.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
it was like, wait, like
Yeah.
this is insane.
Right. Yeah. And I think that again, it's probably gonna it's Yeah, who am I to say? You know, I would love to think that higher ed has an incentive to share more freely their, you know, their methods and technology. Um, at the same time, we don't really have the workforce that that a tech company has. We never have that sort of, that it just doesn't compare. So when you're talking about like way less of a workforce and same amount of needs, then uh, the theory starts to fall apart a little bit. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see. I would love to see WordPress, the WordPress community, especially in higher ed, sort of step up and meet the needs of, you know, the community as a whole. Just if for nothing else, to just sort of support others in higher ed. Um, and I, you know, I do see that at conferences like WP Campus, the thoughts are, it's, you know, there's people aren't guarding their intellectual property per se. They are saying like, look, this is, I figured this out. It's really cool. Come to my talk and I'll show you all about it, and like contact me afterwards. And we can just continue to talk about it.
Yeah, I like that. And that's that kind of ethos we talked about earlier, that WordPress campus, and people like really genuinely are excited about what they figured out.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it's an open source playground to do that is some of that kind of magic, you know,
Right.
and you see people there geeking out on it and having fun because, you know, you might be able to use this. And I just think that ethos seems so far from a fight over trademark and brand, which I had always kind of, you know, believed that WordPress was a really great community because it was open source and because it still let the kind of business ventures, you know, run as they will off of a successful open source base, but at the same time the core remained somewhat, you know, untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, like anything, that's kind of, you know, there's going to be, if you're running a WordPress on your .edu right now and you're seeing what happened with the WordPress community over the last couple of weeks, you're kind of like, especially if you're hosting on WordPress Engine, it's like,
mm-hmm.
wait a second, like, what happened?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right. It's so true.
So, I mean, that's a question that, you know, folks have to, I saw that. I mean, I don't want to get too far afield, so feel free to be like, you know, one of those Gulliver travel figures that knocks me on the head with the pig splatter. But, you know, Kathleen Fitzpatrick was throwing out a thought, who works at Michigan State and kind of runs the H Commons and the big mastodon for the humanities net, et cetera. Was like, what would it look like? What would you need if you wanted to have a kind of academic or scholarly driven alternative to AWS or to some basic hosting? Because that's a whole nother question. And I raised the question at WP Campus, like, what if universities start bringing some of that stuff in-house again? Because I do think there is a point at which the costs of those third-party, you know, vendors, whether we like it, start to become more expensive than everything outsourcing represented in terms of their savings.
Yeah. I think the thing that I appreciate about St. Olaf is that, you know, we don't necessarily have the influx of money that other college, our peer colleges are able to attribute to their or contribute to their IT. We have to be creative. And it's been that way for decades, as far as I can tell. We've got someone really great running our IT department who's been there for decades, and I can see how they've been able to get by without falling into that trap of like, suddenly we're just paying for everything, and all those prices are going up. It's been a great it's been a great example so far of being able to say, okay, what can we do in-house that will allow us some freedom from that, and also, you know, give us a little more control.
And I love that. I love the groups that reinvest in people, right? And make sure that those people run the programs, but it's not like the tail wagging the dog, right? With all of these stuff being outsourced. I mean, one of the community members, Tom Woodward, was talking about the fact that there are schools now that just hire someone to deal with all their vendor relationships. Like that's the ed tech. Like, the ed tech is actually figuring like, how much do we owe you, Blackboard, or what's the deal, Canvas? Are you gonna bill us monthly, right? Like, that crazy.
It shouldn't surprise me, but yeah, that's really something to think about.
Yeah, it really is. So, I mean, and it's an interesting moment for that because WordPress obviously is a tool that many folks, at first it was a blog, but then it became a mighty CMS, and it kind of took over. A lot of universities use it as their CMS. So there's got to be questions around, okay, like what is the healthy part? Like what is the healthy path with WordPress right now?
Yeah.
Right. Are you using ACH? Not, I always say ACH, but it's ACF.
ACF,
right?
Yeah.
Isn't that a WordPress engine developed plugin?
Yeah, it is. We are on ACF Pro, which is not. It's its own thing. So those little tweaks that happened earlier in the week didn't extend to us. But if we hadn't been on Pro, that would be another story. So
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to plugin, and I think the strength of WordPress, one of the big strengths is the ability to create your own plugins, and that's something that I really get a lot of satisfaction out of because it's you really, it gives you that sense of like, I really am in control of our entity, our future, and this is something that I can manage parts of if I need to. It's not like you're subject to a CMS where it's a black box and you don't know what they're doing, when they're going to do it. Updates are happening and you have no control over it. So it's been great to get under the hood and just exercise that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the spirit, right? That WordPress kind of, I think, encourages people who want to stay in a university and develop for it and build something that truly takes the mark of their own. So like St. Olaf's WordPress site is kind of its own, right? Because you could make it so much. It's not just another, strip mall-like approach to a learning environment or a web publishing environment, right?
Yeah.
Which is depressing.
Right. Exactly.
So okay, but I don't want to end on a depressing note. I want to end on a high note. So what's the high note, Bret? What do you got for us?
Well, I've been doom scrolling too much this week. It's really easy to fall into that that like what's going to happen, everything's unstable. It's I think WordPress is just like any large entity. It's going to it involves a lot of people, and most of those people are in it for the best interest of the community. And I think that's just the thing to focus on going forward. I think it's going to get higher ed through what we're going through. And there are creative people thinking of alternate solutions for whatever they might need to. That's been a really cool thing to see. And then just sort of focusing on the community has been great. Sort of a silver lining to some of the turmoil.
Well done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dostoevsky would be proud.
Thank you. That means a lot. I respect that guy.
No, I really appreciate you, Bret, joining us and kind of talking to us like what it means to be a developer right now and higher ed, and kind of your take on it, but also like what you've done. And you've mentioned, not to keep going, but you mentioned that this was your first big project and arguably your first plugin. I don't know. But what else have you worked on since, as a kind of looking forward?
Yeah. As a developer in a team of two at a small liberal arts college, Every project is just completely different. I put together recently a basic block that is sort of a wrapper block. We were moving our library site from Cold Fusion, believe it or not, to WordPress, and I wanted to replicate some of that, like the unison of how the front page was being displayed, and so a block made sense because there were these modules, and because the Gutenberg allows for inner blocks. I basically constructed an outer block that you can drop any, a lot of different types of blocks into, and in that way it was just a wrapper block that sort of lent itself to the aesthetic. I loved doing that because it was like pixel perfect work from something like Cold Fusion, and then replicating that challenge of making that look the same, but act completely differently under the hood, was really satisfying.
You were animating WordPress as Cold Fusion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so everything's a little different. I am actually looking at a Cold Fusion app coming up, because it's there's a framework for it that we already created some time ago, and I can use that. And so that's web development, is like, hey, I've got these bits and pieces over here. I've got these databases over here. How do I put them together?
Yeah.
And that's just a completely different way of thinking about it from WordPress. So.
And so you can step out of the WordPress space and go into a entirely different development.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It's one of the cool things about where I work.
Great. Well, look, awesome. Meredith, please.
Yeah, that's awesome. Kind of a wrap up for me. The last little bit of our conversation, I keep thinking of like, in these kind of creative restraints of open source versus like community pushback and stuff like that, we get scrappy developers that make things out of it, and in a good way. So I scrappy is just the word of my day.
I like that.
Yeah,
scrappy. I'll own that.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Bret, for joining us. This is awesome to kick off our conference series from WordPress Campus to reclaim and all sorts of stuff, and talking about your WordPress multi-site and the plugin. It's awesome. So thank you so much. Drop my earbud.
Thank you. It's
Friday, and thanks for watching, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Bret. Thank you, Meredith.